For decades, anthropologists have known that Native Americans descended from Siberian migrants who crossed into the Americas thousands of years ago. But in 2026, something strange happened. Suddenly, viral videos started claiming this was a shocking revelation that completely overturned everything Indigenous peoples have always said about themselves. The twist? The science had been public for years. What changed wasn't the evidence. What changed was how someone decided to weaponize it. This is the story of how settled science became a tool for modern political warfare. The video itself is slick. It hits YouTube with a title designed to provoke "The Sioux were never what we thought." DNA finally revealed the truth. The thumbnail shows a DNA helix dissolving into a map of North America. Within weeks, it accumulates millions of views, millions of shares. People across social media are posting it as definitive proof that Indigenous land claims are built on myth, that oral histories are lies, that everything Indigenous peoples have claimed about their origins and their connection to the land is directly contradicted by hard science. The creator presents himself as someone finally exposing the truth that mainstream academia and Indigenous activism have conspired to hide from the public. The narrative is seductive. It feels like revelation. But here's where the manipulation begins. Every major claim in this video relies on either deliberately misrepresenting established science, presenting decades-old research as if it just broke, or distorting the implications of genetic findings so thoroughly that the actual meaning becomes fundamentally inverted. To understand how this works, how it becomes so persuasive, we need to start with what the science actually says, because the scientific foundation here is real. The research is legitimate. The institutions are credible. It's the interpretation that's poisoned. It's the narrative frame that's constructed to deceive. Beginning around 20,000 years ago, human populations living in what is now Siberia did migrate across Beringia, a landmass that once connected modern-day Russia to Alaska before it was submerged by rising sea levels after the Ice Age. This migration happened in multiple waves, spread across thousands of years. The first major expansion occurred roughly 15,000 years ago, when early peoples pushed into North America and eventually spread south through Central and South America, reaching the southern tip of the continent within a few thousand years. These were the ancestors of most Native American populations today. This isn't controversial. This isn't being hidden. This is foundational anthropology that's been confirmed by decades of archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, isotope studies from bone chemistry, and more recently, by ancient DNA studies from multiple international research teams. Universities like Copenhagen, Harvard, Cambridge, the Smithsonian Institution, they've all contributed to this body of knowledge, and not a single one of them presents this as contradicting Indigenous narratives about themselves. The DNA evidence is genuinely sophisticated, representing some of the most advanced genetic analysis ever conducted. Scientists have sequenced genomes from ancient individuals found at archaeological sites across Siberia, Beringia, and North America, dating back thousands of years, some reaching back over 30,000 years into the past. They've compared this ancient DNA to modern Native American populations and to present-day Siberian groups, using advanced statistical methods to trace patterns of inheritance and population mixing. What they found confirms what was already suspected from other evidence. Native Americans have ancestry that traces back to Siberian populations. The genetic data shows that between 14 and 38% of Native American ancestry comes from ancient populations that were living in Siberia tens of thousands of years ago, with the exact percentage varying by population and region. The rest comes from ancient East Asian populations, likely from populations living in southern Siberia, Mongolia, and the Far East. This mixture created a distinct ancestral population that then gave rise to all modern Native Americans. The research team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev from the University of Copenhagen sequenced genomes from 34 individuals spanning 60,000 to 600 years ago, providing an unprecedented view of how populations changed, mixed, and adapted across this vast region over tens of millennia. The research also revealed something more complex. Native Americans didn't arrive in a single wave. There were at least 3 distinct migration events. The first was the major expansion around 15,000 years ago. But then, thousands of years later, separate populations migrated from Siberia into the Arctic regions of North America. These became the ancestors of Paleo-Eskimo peoples. Later still, another wave brought Na-Adin speakers, the ancestors of peoples like the Apache and Navajo. Each of these migrations involved different genetic lineages and happened at different times. This layering of population movements is actually supported by linguistic evidence, which linguist Joseph Greenberg had proposed back in 1987, based purely on analyzing language families across the Americas. And here's something the viral videos completely ignore. The migration patterns were never one way. Recent genetic discoveries, published just a few years ago, show that Native Americans didn't simply arrive and stay isolated. Around 500 to 2200 years ago, people from northwestern Alaska, descendants of the very first migrants, boated back across the Bering Sea into Siberia. Genetic analysis of remains found on the Kamchatka Peninsula shows that indigenous Siberians living just 5 centuries ago carried DNA from North American ancestors. This means populations on both sides of the Bering Strait maintained contact and genetic exchange for thousands of years. The story isn't one of invasion or one-way conquest. It's one of dynamic, reciprocal human movement across a region that served as a crossroads for multiple populations. All of this research has been published in peer-reviewed journals like Nature and Science. It's been featured in scientific journalism for years. It's standard curriculum in anthropology courses. University of Copenhagen researchers, teams from Harvard, the Smithsonian, multiple international institutions, they've all contributed to this body of knowledge. And crucially, none of it is secret. None of it contradicts what indigenous peoples have always understood about their origins. But the viral videos present this as a dramatic new revelation. They frame it as if scientists just discovered something shocking that indigenous communities have been hiding or denying. They use language designed to suggest that indigenous peoples claimed they were the first humans everywhere, that they never migrated, that they spontaneously appeared on the continent. This is a straw man. Indigenous origin narratives vary enormously across different nations and regions. Many Sioux origin stories, for instance, describe emergence from the earth, symbolic representations of spiritual and cultural connections to land, not literal denials of ancestral migrations. And yet the videos present genetic evidence of Siberian ancestry as if it's shattering some universal indigenous claim. This is where the manipulation becomes dangerous. The videos use scientific accuracy in isolation to support an ideological argument. Yes, there was Siberian ancestry. Yes, there were migrations. Yes, indigenous peoples have complex genetic histories. But then the videos leap to a conclusion that doesn't follow from the science at all, that therefore indigenous peoples have no legitimate claim to ancestral lands, that oral histories are worthless, that the entire foundation of indigenous identity is based on mythology that DNA has now disproven. The Sioux specifically provide a clear example of how this distortion works. The Sioux, or Lakota Teton as they're also known, are part of a larger linguistic and cultural family with deep roots in North American history. The archaeological and genetic evidence shows that Sioux ancestors migrated from the Ohio Valley region, likely several centuries before European contact, and adapted to the Great Plains. They developed the Plains Indian culture that later became famous in American historical consciousness. They became expert horsemen, buffalo hunters, warriors. This transformation happened over generations as they encountered new environments and new peoples. The Sioux oral histories often describe emergence narratives and spiritual connections to the land. The genetic evidence shows Siberian ancestry dating back thousands of years. These aren't contradictory. They're complementary pieces of the same human story. But the viral videos frame this layering of evidence as a contradiction. They present it as if the Sioux have always claimed they originated in the Great Plains and were never anywhere else, and that DNA proves this wrong. The reality is more nuanced. The Sioux, like all peoples, have multiple ways of understanding their origins. Spiritual narratives about emergence and connection to land, historical records of migration and adaptation, and now genetic evidence confirming ancient ancestry patterns. These exist together. They don't negate each other. Consider what we learned about Sitting Bull, one of the most famous Lakota leaders. In 2021, researchers made headlines by confirming, using ancient DNA extracted from a lock of Sitting Bull's hair, that a man named Ernie LaPointe was indeed his great-grandson. This was presented as a landmark achievement in genetic genealogy, the first time ancient DNA had been used to confirm a familial relationship between a historical figure and a contemporary person across such a distant generational gap. The technique involved analyzing autosomal DNA, the non-gender-specific genetic material inherited equally from both parents. They compared the DNA from Sitting Bull's hair, which had been stored in the Smithsonian Museum for over a century, to samples from LaPointe and other Lakota Sioux individuals. The genetic match was clear and profound. What's remarkable about this finding isn't that it contradicted Lakota knowledge, it's that it confirmed it. Sitting Bull's family had always maintained that LaPointe was his great-grandson. This genetic validation didn't overturn oral history, it vindicated it. And yet, the viral videos use this very same genetic science to suggest that DNA somehow debunks indigenous narratives. The contradiction is obvious once you look closely. The videos also deploy a rhetorical trick that's become increasingly common in misinformation. They acknowledge that the science is legitimate. Yes, there were migrations from Siberia. Yes, this happened thousands of years ago. But then they make an ideological leap that the science doesn't support. They claim that because Native Americans have Siberian ancestry, because they migrated from Asia, this somehow invalidates their status as indigenous to the Americas. This logic would apply equally to every human population on Earth. Europeans have ancestry in Africa. East Asians have ancestry in Central Asia. Every population descended from migrants at some point in deep history. Yet we don't use this fact to claim that Europeans aren't indigenous to Europe or that East Asians don't belong in East Asia. The standard is applied selectively to indigenous peoples, which reveals that the argument isn't really about the science at all. One particular claim in the videos deserves close attention because it exposes the ideological core of the entire narrative. The videos assert that genetic evidence debunks what they call the indigenous myth, that all of Canada's indigenous peoples have lived in their ancestral homelands from time immemorial. This phrasing is revealing. It presents a strawman claim that indigenous peoples assert they've occupied the exact same territory without any change, migration, or adaptation for all of human history. This isn't a position any serious scholar of indigenous history holds. Indigenous nations have complex histories of migration, conflict, alliance, and cultural development. The Sioux themselves were pushed onto the Great Plains by conflicts with other tribes, and eventually by European encroachment. This is documented history that indigenous communities themselves understand and discuss. But the videos use genetic evidence of deep time migration, something happening thousands of years ago, to argue against contemporary indigenous sovereignty and land claims. It's a category error presented as scientific truth. The Sioux Nation's historical right to the Great Plains isn't invalidated by the fact that their ancestors migrated there. From elsewhere centuries ago, any more than American claims to California are invalidated by the fact that their ancestors migrated there centuries ago. Yet the standard is applied asymmetrically, wielded specifically against indigenous peoples. The timing of these videos is also significant. Why now? Why did this particular narrative suddenly gain traction in 2026, when the underlying science has been available for years, sometimes for decades? The answer lies in the political climate. Indigenous land claims, treaty rights, and sovereignty movements have been gaining visibility and legal momentum. Land-back initiatives, repatriation of sacred objects, recognition of indigenous jurisdiction on traditional territories, these are happening in courts and legislatures. The viral videos appear exactly when they're most useful as a rhetorical weapon against these movements. The message is clear. Genetic science proves that indigenous peoples don't really belong anywhere, that their claims to ancestral lands are based on mythology, that their oral histories are worthless compared to DNA evidence. This is a profound misuse of science. Science doesn't make moral or legal claims. Genetic evidence that your ancestors migrated from point A to point B thousands of years ago tells you something about deep human history. It doesn't tell you whether your descendants deserve rights to that land today. It doesn't invalidate oral histories or cultural narratives. It doesn't prove that competing territorial claims should be resolved in favor of settler colonialism over indigenous sovereignty. These are political and legal questions that science can inform but cannot answer. The irony is that for many indigenous communities, genetic research is actually confirming what they've always known. Oral histories often preserve accurate information across generations, stories about emergence from specific places, about connections to particular lands, about ancestral journeys. These aren't always metaphorical. They're sometimes precise historical records, transmitted through verbal culture rather than written documentation. When genetic evidence comes back showing patterns that align with traditional knowledge, it's not a surprise to indigenous scholars. It's confirmation. The idea that DNA somehow contradicts oral history is itself based on a false hierarchy that privileges written Western science over other valid forms of knowledge transmission. For the Sioux specifically, the genetic story reinforces what historical and archaeological records already show. Sioux nations have complex, dynamic histories. They adapted to their environments. They migrated in response to conflicts and opportunities. They developed sophisticated cultural practices. They maintained genetic and cultural connections across vast distances. The genetic evidence showing Siberian ancestries, dating back tens of thousands of years, with later waves of migration, with complex mixture between populations. This tells the story of human resilience and adaptation. It's the opposite of a debunking. It's a confirmation of the depth and complexity of human history that indigenous communities have always understood. But the viral videos never acknowledge this alignment between science and indigenous knowledge. Instead, they frame science and indigenous narratives as opposed. They create a false binary where one must invalidate the other. This binary serves a specific purpose. It allows the videos to weaponize scientific legitimacy against indigenous claims. They can point to DNA evidence and say, science proves everything you thought was wrong. The fact that this is a misuse of science, that it's ignoring decades of scholarship, showing the complexity of indigenous history and the alignment between genetic and traditional knowledge, doesn't matter to the narrative they're selling. The videos also make much of linguistic evidence. They claim that linguistic analysis shows Sioux peoples came from the Ohio Valley, migrated to the Great Plains, and therefore don't really belong on the plains. But this argument mistakes historical migration for lack of belonging. The Sioux did migrate from the Ohio Valley region. This is documented in historical records and archaeological evidence, but they did so over centuries, adapting to each new environment, developing deep cultural connections to the lands they inhabited. By the time European contact occurred, the Sioux were thoroughly integrated into the Great Plains ecosystem and culture. Centuries of occupation, of adaptation, of spiritual and cultural development, this creates a form of belonging that isn't erased by the fact that their ancestors lived elsewhere previously. Every population on Earth has a migration history. The question of indigenous rights isn't about whether a people migrated in the distant past. It's about whether they have continuous cultural, historical, and ancestral connections to territories they occupy, and whether those connections deserve legal and moral recognition. The Sioux have continuous occupation of the Great Plains from at least the 1600s onward. They have deep spiritual and cultural connections to the land. They have maintained genetic and cultural continuity through centuries of contact, conflict, and change. Whether their ancestors lived in Ohio 1,000 years ago is irrelevant to these contemporary rights. What makes the misinformation in these videos particularly dangerous is that it borrows the language and aesthetics of scientific authority. It uses real research, real institutions, real scientists, but it weaponizes these genuine elements to support an ideological conclusion that the science doesn't actually support. It's a form of scientific manipulation that's become increasingly common in recent years, taking legitimate findings and distorting their meaning to serve political ends. The scientific community itself hasn't endorsed this narrative. Universities and research institutions that have contributed to genetics research on Native American populations generally don't interpret their findings as debunking indigenous narratives or invalidating indigenous claims. Many geneticists have actually pushed back against misrepresentations of their work. But once misinformation goes viral, it's incredibly difficult to correct. The viral videos have been viewed millions of times. They've shaped public perception. People now believe that DNA science has proven something about indigenous peoples that contradicts their own understanding of themselves. The real story here, the story that actually deserves attention, is far more interesting than the false narrative of debunking. It's the story of how human populations moved, adapted, mixed, and developed over tens of thousands of years. It's the story of how Siberian peoples eventually became Native American peoples, developing distinct. The Sioux genetic story is indeed complex. It does reveal layers of ancestry and migration, but it doesn't reveal what the viral videos claim. It reveals the resilience of human populations, their ability to adapt and thrive in new environments, their capacity to maintain genetic and cultural continuity across centuries. It reveals that identity isn't simple, that belonging isn't determined by where your ancestors lived 5,000 years ago, and that oral histories often capture profound truths about human experience that science later confirms. When you strip away the sensationalism from these videos, when you actually examine what the genetic research says and what it doesn't say, you're left with a troubling conclusion. This is misinformation designed specifically to undermine indigenous rights and sovereignty. It takes legitimate science and distorts it in service of a political goal. It creates a false binary between science and indigenous knowledge. And it does all of this while wrapping itself in the language of truth and revelation. The Sioux were never what the viral videos claim. They have always been what they understand themselves to be, a people with deep roots in North America, with complex histories of migration and adaptation, with spiritual and cultural connections to their lands, with ancestral lineages that can be traced back through genetics and through oral tradition. DNA doesn't contradict this. DNA confirms it. The manipulation lies not in what the science says, but in how it's being weaponized against the peoples whose own histories it should illuminate and validate.